What is your Kubernetes security checklist? Are there things that people should be doing with it straight out of the box to make it more secure? You were mentioning that a little bit with, turning on and off, privileges and what have you.
Yeah, I'm actually working right now with six security docs. We just had a meeting about it today, and
Hmm.
it's actually nothing. There's nothing like that in the Kubernetes documentation.
Yeah.
There's like your basic, learn how to do stuff, but there really isn't a checklist. There's a roadmap for technologies, but yeah. Anyways,
Yeah. Well, I
uh,
think, didn't you say basically they want it to be as open as possible? So they're not necessarily going to like tell you what
yeah,
to do in that regard, but it might be worth it.
yeah. No, I 100% agree. Really, it's you really need to know the basics of Kubernetes first
Okay.
before like really go and play with Kubernetes. Don't put it
Hmm.
into production. Don't, take your
Right.
time, get to know it, go and get the certs, learn. Then what you want to be looking at is I like to work on the pod level. So if you're a developer, for example, and you're going to start and you're going to containerize it, you need to know what's going on in your container. So that means you need to know how much resource it needs, how much CPU, how much memory, what privilege does it need? Does it need syscalls? All of that can be configured in the deployment spec, right? And that's going to cover most of your use cases, right? Is it a stateful application? Really, we should not be writing to the host. So, learning that also helps you learn to be a better developer in Kubernetes, because really originally it was designed for stateless applications, right? And less stateful applications. It seems like statefulness was more of an afterthought. So I think if you're a developer, you're working containers, start at the pod spec, start with deployments with security context, user IDs and group IDs specifically, because that's another issue. And then you can kind of understand, okay, now I know what my application needs. Now I can actively communicate that to a DevOps team or to the infrastructure team to say, okay, you can firewall off these ports. This is all my application needs, right? So if I was going to answer for the checklist, I'd say start at the deployment level,
Okay.
learn what's going on in the container, learn the vulnerabilities of the container, and then shut everything down using the deployment spec that you can. And then after that, hopefully, then you get more into an operationalizing and more DevOps specific team. I
Or
think it really
customizing.
depends
Yeah.
on it. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
depends on. Hopefully, you can hand that problem off to somebody else.
Okay, there you go. That's always my favorite piece of advice.
Yeah.
um, so to move sort of one level up from there, what are some ways you'd recommend that Kubernetes be made more safe in the future? I mean, as long as we're writing letters to Santa right now, what open letter would
Oh,
you give on that level? What are some things that are known about and either being worked on or not known about or not being given enough attention to? What do you think?
uh, so I mean, I'm trying to help with this. I think documentation and actually vocalizing the value of doing these things, especially earlier on. I'm part of the business value subcommittee because I think you're starting to realize that Kubernetes itself needs to actually be vocalized. The actual value of it, because sometimes there's just so much information out there. So that'd be one. The other, I know they're working on multi-tenancy. I haven't really looked too much into that project, but starting with research and starting with a bunch of researchers working in Kubernetes, that can get hairy real fast when you're talking about stateful applications and using POSIX and UIDs and GIDs, and what happens when people want to switch groups, and it can get somewhat hairy. So I would love to see something where research became more useful, because I think that it has exponential gains in the research community, especially to be able to, for a researcher to have their container that they run their applications on and just go and drop it anywhere. The other thing too is, if you're running parallel workloads, a lot of the code for research is not necessarily optimized for large scale infrastructure, and so you actually end up getting a lot of wasted CPU time.
Okay.
I think Kubernetes would be able to take more advantage of that. I just haven't really seen as much of a push in research because there is such a big knowledge gap, right? And researchers really are focused on their work. So I would love it if I had a wish list.
New episodes of the Cyberwork podcast are available every Monday at 1 p.m. Central. And don't forget to check out our hands-on training series, Cyberwork Applied. Each week, expert Infosec instructors teach you a new cybersecurity skill and show you how that skill applies to real-world scenarios. Go to infosecinstitute.com/learn to stay up to date on all things cyberwork.